Buenos días, good morning, good afternoon. For those following us in English, please note that you can change the language at the bottom of your screen. Bienvenidos a este seminario web sobre el lanzamiento de nuestro estudio sobre las cualificaciones de personas refugiadas y desplazadas en América Latina y el Caribe. Después de todas las intervenciones, abriremos el espacio para la discusión y si tienen preguntas o comentarios, por favor, escríbanlos en la función de Q&A de Zoom. Para empezar, invito a Borhene Chakroun, el director interino de UNESCO IESALC y director de la División de Políticas y Aprendizaje a lo largo de la vida en la UNESCO. Borhene, the floor is yours.
Borhene, the floor is yours.
Gracias, Vanja, estimados colegas.
Thank you very much.
Buenos días, very good morning. Es un placer estar hoy con ustedes inaugurar este seminario web en mi calidad de director interino de UNESCO IESALC. Permítanme comenzar reafirmando mi compromiso con la educación superior, una cartera que dirijo a nivel global en la UNESCO y con el fortalecimiento de los sistemas en América Latina y el Caribe.
In order to talk
Dear
about
colleagues,
Latin America and the Caribbean.
Our discussion today regarding the recognition of qualifications for refugees and displaced persons in Latin America and the Caribbean is timely and obviously needed. The urgency of this discussion and this study could not be clearer. Worldwide, only 7% of refugees access higher education, compared to 43% of the general population in Latin America and the Caribbean. Access rates range from 2 to 12%, while the regional average for the general population stands at 53%. This disparity is more than statistics. It represents doctors unable to practice, engineers confined to the informal sector, and teachers whose knowledge and experience go to waste. Latin America and the Caribbean, historically a region of outward migration, now hosts more than 20 million refugees and displaced persons, the majority from within the region itself. Colleagues, we live in a context where some portray refugees and displaced persons negatively, overlooking their resilience and contributions to economies and societies. Displacement is not a choice, and framing it as a burden fuels stigma instead of empathy and inclusion and human rights. At UNESCO, the recognition of qualifications for refugees and displaced persons lays at the very heart of our work and mission, in the work we are doing to fulfilling the SDG 4 commitment. Recognizing the qualification of population, even when documentary evidence is incomplete, is a core principle of all UNESCO recognition convention, and is put in practice through our UNESCO qualification passport, an international tool designed to help refugees and vulnerable migrants have their prior learning and qualification recognized, even when they cannot provide complete documentation. The report we are launching today is the first systematic and comprehensive study of qualification recognition for refugees and displaced persons in the region. It responds not only to a critical gap in specialized literature, but more importantly, to the pressing operational needs of UNESCO member states grappling with unprecedented migration flow without the necessary technical tools to respond to that. Crucially, this report does more than diagnose challenges. It also showcases best practices from across the region that can be adapted to different national contexts, also supporting the implementation of the Buenos Aires Convention. This is about knowledge sharing. It's about peer learning as we see it at UNESCO. Its recommendation organized across clear time horizons, from immediate and urgent measures requiring no legislative change to more long-term structural reform that provide governments with a practical roadmap that we hope can help advancing this agenda. In the follow-up, we'll be developing simple guidelines tailored to the regional realities in close cooperation with key networks, CINALC and Ricola Latin, and with member states across Latin America and the Caribbean. This regional work has also a global resonance, as it will also serve an essential contribution to the forthcoming global recommendation on the recognition of qualifications for refugees and displaced persons under the work we are doing at UNESCO on the Global Convention on the Recognition of Qualifications Concerning Higher Education, as it was adopted at the second Intergovernmental Conference. Colleagues, I wish to express my sincere thanks to my colleague and friend Gonzalo Baroni, President of the Buenos Aires Convention Committee, for preparing this report with the support of my colleagues Francesc Pedro, that you know, the former director of IESALC, and my colleague Vanja Gutović. I also extend my gratitude to our partners in UNHCR, the CINALC network, and the government of the regions for their valuable support and contributions. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Over to you, Vanja.
Thank you very much, Borhene, for getting us started today. Ahora le doy la palabra a Gonzalo Baroni,
I'll now pass
quien
it
nos
over to
presentará
Gonzalo
los
Baroni, who's
principales
going to introduce us
hallazgos y
the main
recomendaciones
findings
del
and
estudio.
recommendations
Gonzalo,
of this
adelante, por favor.
study. Gonzalo, the floor is yours.
Muy buenos días, muchas
Good morning.
gracias.
Thank you very
Le voy a
much.
pedir al equipo de
I'll
UNESCO IESALC si
kindly
puede empezar a
ask
exhibir
the UNESCO
la
IESALC team
presentación.
if they could share my presentation with the rest of you on screen. Thank you very much.
Sí, muchas gracias. Bueno, primero que nada,
Thank you. Okay,
agradecerles
first of all, I'd like to start by thanking
a todo el equipo de UNESCO IESALC.
the
En
whole
primer lugar, las
UNESCO
palabras
IESALC team.
del
First of
director en
all,
funciones,
the
Borhene
opening
Chakroun.
remarks
Muchas
by Borhene
gracias
Chakroun
por tus
are
cariñosas palabras, por
welcome,
tu
and
apoyo
thank you very much
en
for your warm
este proceso tan
remarks
importante
and
de
acknowledging this very
apoyar a los
important process
refugiados y a los
of
desplazados
supporting
forzados
refugees
en la
and
región
forced
de América Latina y el
displaced
Caribe.
people in the region of
También
Latin
le quiero
America
agradecer
and the Caribbean.
especialmente
I
a
would
todo el
also
equipo
like
de
to
UNESCO
especially
IESALC,
offer my gratitude to the whole
encabezado para
UNESCO
este estudio
IESALC team
con Vanja
led in
y
this
todo el
team
equipo que
for this
ha
study
apoyado en
by
cada
Vanja
momento este
and the
proceso.
whole
Y
team
luego a
that
mis
have
colegas de
supported this
panel, en
process.
los cuales
And I would also
haremos
like to
algunos
thank
comentarios
my
y responderemos algunas
panel
preguntas,
colleagues
especialmente
to whom
a
we are going to be sharing some
Manal,
questions with,
representante de
especially
ACNUR,
Manal, who's
experta
representative
en la
from
temática de refugiados, que nos ha dado
UNHCR,
una visión
who's
muy
an
profunda
expert
al
on the
respecto. Francisco
refugee matters,
Contreras, experto
and
también en
also
la
Francisco
región y el
Contreras, who's
reconocimiento de
also an expert in
cualificaciones,
the
que
region
nos ha
in the
ayudado
acknowledgement of
enormemente en este
qualifications, who has
proceso de
helped us out
revisión. Y
greatly
también a
for
Ricardo
this
Moreno,
overview
viceministro
process, and
colombiano,
also Ricardo
que nos va a
Moreno,
dar una
Vice
visión
Minister
desde
of
la política
Education in Colombia, who's
pública
also going to
en
provide us
Latinoamérica y el Caribe.
a government
Vamos a comenzar
overview in
entonces
terms
con
of what it
la
means, the implementation of such measures. So we're going to start
slide, la
with the
primera
first slide.
Les pido, por favor, si pueden ir pasando.
And if you could please go next. Thank you.
Primero, un mensaje inicial y un estado de situación.
So,
Nosotros tenemos un dato
just to
global que para
start
muchos que están
this
en la
presentation off, we
temática
have some global
puede ser
figures
redundante, pero me
that for
parece
those of you who are in the field
importante destacar
might
que
find
el
redundant, but I think it
43%
is
de los jóvenes a
important to
nivel global
remember that
acceden a educación superior.
43%
Sin
of
embargo, solo
global
el
youngsters
7% de aquellos
can
que son
only
refugiados
access to
están
a
en la
higher
misma línea.
education.
Con esto no
However,
estamos
only
diciendo que los
7% of
números
them are
de
refugees.
43% sean
With this,
buenos. Sin embargo,
we're
esta
not saying that
comparación
these are good
ayuda
figures. However,
enormemente a
this
entender
comparison is
la
useful
disparidad.
for us to
En segundo lugar,
briefly
las
understand
25 millones de personas
inequalities.
desplazadas en América
Second of all,
Latina y el
more
Caribe,
than
datos
25 million people
2024.
have been
Y
displaced
por
in
último,
Latin
un
America and
mensaje
in the Caribbean.
inicial
This is coming from the
de por qué
2024
nos
latest
trae hasta
data
aquí.
that
El
we've collected.
reconocimiento académico lo
And
entendemos como
lastly,
clave para
the
la
academic
integración y el
recognition
empleo
is
en nuestra
key for
región. Siguiente,
integration
por
and
favor.
employability in a region. Next, please.
Como objetivo del informe,
And the main
en su
objective,
momento, y
as the
también le
primary
quiero
objective of
agradecer
this
al
report,
director
and then I would
saliente,
also like
Francesc
to thank
Pedro, nos
the
solicita
former
realizar este informe,
director,
queríamos
Francesc
buscar,
Pedro,
en
when
primer
he asked
lugar,
us to
mapear el estado
draft
actual de
this
los sistemas de
report, we wanted to
reconocimiento
switch
de los países, de
the
los Estados
current
miembros.
situation of the
Segundo, identificar vacíos
recognition systems
normativos
that
y
we have in the
operativos.
region.
Tercero,
Second of all,
sistematizar
we
buenas
wanted
prácticas.
to
Y,
identify the
por
possible
último,
gaps.
formular
And third of all, we wanted to
recomendaciones,
systematize the
pero que
best
sean
practices. And
viables
lastly, we
y que
wanted
estén
to draft
alineadas
some
éticamente con los
recommendations that are
objetivos de la
feasible
UNESCO.
and that are
Siguiente, por favor.
ethically aligned with UNESCO objectives.
El panorama regional de movilidad
The
forzada
regional
tiene
overview of forced mobility
algunos hitos, algunos
has got
puntos
some
a destacar. En primer
milestones
lugar, el
or
éxodo
some
venezolano.
specific points
Hay
to have in mind.
7.7 millones de
First of all,
venezolanos,
we have
según
the
estudios
Venezuelan exodus
recientes,
that
que
had
han abandonado el
7.7
país en los
million
últimos
people
años,
that have
y
left
de esos
their home
6,8
country,
millones
and out of them,
están en América
6.8
Latina y el
millions
Caribe.
are
Por
in
lo
Latin
tanto,
America and
este
in the
desafío
Caribbean.
es muy
So
importante
that's why
para
this
nuestro
represents
país.
an important
En
challenge
segundo
for
lugar,
all our
Centroamérica y
countries.
México,
Second of
con
all, Central America
un gran punto que hay que
Mexico
atender y que
has
entendemos que los estados están trabajando
shown
fuertemente en
to
eso, que es
be
los niveles de
hotspots
violencia
for us
y
to
las
pay
nuevas
attention
rutas
to,
que
and we
se
need to
están
create
delineando a la
new
hora de
pathways
la migración.
in order to
Un
serve
tercer
the
punto es
migration through these countries.
Haití y el Caribe, en
As a
particular,
third point, we
cómo
want to
hay
mention the
situaciones de
situation in
emergencia muy
Haiti and the
prolongadas
Caribbean region,
y
because there are
que las
long-standing
situaciones de atención a
emergencies
la
in this
educación
region.
superior
And
a
in that
veces no
sense,
están tan
the
presentes
service
en
to
la agenda de
education
política
is
pública.
not
Y por
as,
último, un dato
let's
que
say,
no es
as
menor,
present in
nombrar
the
que uno cuando
public
coloca
open
refugiados,
agenda, in the
desplazamientos
open public
forzados a la
agenda of
región,
these
no puede
countries.
escapar
And
de lo
last
que
but not
sucede en el
least,
tapón del
the
Darién.
last
Esta
point
zona que está
has to do
ubicada
with the Darien Gap, which is a
específicamente
region that is
entre los
located
límites de Sudamérica
between
y
the borders
Centroamérica,
of South
donde
America and Central America,
tenemos uno
where
de
we see
es todos los días y en situaciones
one of the highest
calamitosas. Hay varios
influxes
informes de ACNUR
throughout the
que
region.
demuestran
So
esta
when we see
situación
the
y que tendríamos
UNHCR
que
reports, we
trabajar
can
fuerte.
see the direct
Siguiente, por
numbers
favor.
that we should be working for in this region. Next, please.
La brecha en la educación superior, como decía al principio,
Now, the
es
gap in
en un
higher
global,
education, as I said at the beginning,
acceden
at
los
the
jóvenes un
global level, we
43%,
see
un
that
7% de los
43% of young
refugiados,
people
y un
are
dato que no es
accessing
menor, en América
education, and
Latina y el
refugees
Caribe
7%.
es
And then another piece of
muy
data that is
variable.
not minor
El
is that in Latin America and
acceso
the
de
Caribbean, this
refugiados
is
a la
quite
educación superior
variable.
varía entre un
The
2
access
a
to
un
higher education
12%
by
según el
refugees
país y
varies from
también
2
según
to
las
12%
estadísticas
according to
que
the
son
country
accesibles.
and
Esto
according to
está
what we
bastante
have
alejado
in
de la
the
meta
statistics
propuesta
that we
por
have
ACNUR
available, which is
de
very far from the
15,
goal
15
established
para el
by
2030 o
UNHCR
15 by
that was
30
established by
para alcanzar
15 by 30
15%
in
en
order
el
to
año
reach
2030.
15%
Siguiente, por
by
favor.
2030.
Algunos marcos normativos internacionales y regionales que han
different frameworks, both
justamente
on
puesto
international and
línea
regional
en el
norms,
trabajo que
have
realizamos.
placed
En primer lugar, la
different
Convención
alignment
Global
while
y
assessing
el
the
Convenio de Buenos
Global
Aires, que fue
Convention,
nombrado
as well
por
as the
nuestro
Buenos
director,
Aires
Borhene
Convention,
Chakroun, y que tan
provided by
fuertemente ha trabajado
Director
el área de
Chakroun,
educación
who has
superior de UNESCO
worked
París
a lot
para
for
llevar adelante
this
a nivel
different
global
framework to make sure that we
desde el
can
año
progress on a global
2019,
level. Having
buscando
done so since
una mayor
2019,
flexibilidad,
always seeking the greatest
no
flexibility
priorizar los documentos per
without
se, sino
prioritizing
facilitar el acceso
documentation
para
per
las
se,
personas,
but
porque en
instead
definitiva el
facilitating
objetivo final
access to
es
people,
el acceso a la
because
educación
the end
superior.
goal,
Luego el
regardless,
Convenio
is
de
of
Buenos
course to have
Aires,
access to higher
que
education. We
fue
have the
en el
Buenos Aires
año 2019
Convention,
y
which
luego
again was
fue
issued in
puesto
2019, and then we
en
had
marcha en el año 2022
in
la ciudad de
2022
Colonia, en
how it was
Uruguay.
issued in the city
Ahí
of
se hace un fuerte foco en la
Colonia in
inclusión y la no
Uruguay.
discriminación,
That's where we
para
look at,
destacarlo.
for
Y luego
example,
también un
regarding
marco regional que
non-discrimination,
es muy
and
importante, es la
also
Declaración
saw a
de
regional
Cartagena
framework,
del
which is
año
known as
84
the
y sus
Declaration of
sucesivas
Cartagena back
modificaciones,
in
que
84.
ahí nos
And it
plantea
was
una
there
definición
where they provided a
ampliada de
definition,
refugio.
a
Adelante, por
broadened
favor.
one for everything regarding refugee.
Algunos obstáculos estructurales que
And some
nos
structural
parecía
obstacles that
importante destacar en la región,
we've seen a bit
algunos
that
no
want to
escapan de
highlight
lo
in
que
the
es a nivel
region.
global, pero que se
Some maybe
enmarcan
might not be part of the global stage, but
en la situación de refugio en el
still in
mundo.
this, under a situation of
Primero, la
refugees,
adopción
the first thing that we see here
verificable, hay una falta muy
is
grande en la
a
gran
lack,
mayoría de las
a
personas
vast lack
desplazadas.
at that,
Luego,
of
el lado
displaced
de
persons
los
and
estados,
verifiable
riquezas
documentation.
legales
Then
y
looking,
muchas
for
veces
example,
costos
at how
excesivos.
different states
Hay
may
una
have excessive costs
fuerte
for them.
brecha
There's
digital e
a
idiomática. El caso
wide
de América
gap
Latina y el
there when it comes
Caribe
to
a veces
digital
termina
and language.
de lado el
Sometimes in the
tema
case of
idiomático,
Latin
sin
America
embargo,
and the
está muy
Caribbean, it's
presente.
more of
Cuando
a
vemos,
digital
por
aspect,
ejemplo, y
but
vamos a los
still,
casos del
it
Caribe,
is something
vamos
that
a
is
encontrar
present. And for
algunos
example,
ejemplos.
looking
La
at the
desigualdad de
Caribbean cases,
género,
we'll
las
see
jefas de
a couple
hogar
of bullet points
y,
there.
por último, el
We have
déficit
gender
institucional
inequality
en el
as well as
reconocimiento de
institutional
cualificaciones.
deficit
Siguiente,
when
por
it
favor.
comes to acknowledging qualifications. Next, please.
Los procedimientos actuales, esto simplemente también para establecer
Current
algunos
procedures, so
criterios
these are just to
de los
establish some
comunes
part
para todos
of
los
the
escuchas,
criteria,
los estándares y los
common
adaptativos.
criteria,
Los estándares nos
such
referimos
as what
a los
is
más tradicionales, llamémosle, la legalización, la
adaptive and
traducciones,
standard, for
la
example,
apostilla, y
legalization,
los
translation,
adaptativos es lo que
apostilles.
muchos países están avanzando, que son
Basically, we see
entrevistas
how many different
personalizadas,
countries are
tener un
progressing
portafolio
toward a
de
personalized
acciones posibles y reconocimiento, pruebas
portfolio of different actions
diagnósticas
or
y
acknowledgements,
el reconocimiento de
diagnoses,
aprendizajes previos.
trials, etc., that would come with it. Next, please.
You are muted, Gonzalo.
Siguiente, por favor. Sorry.
Next, please.
Thank you,
Excuse
Brett.
me.
Aquí algunas innovaciones tecnológicas que
And
hemos
there's
encontrado.
some
En
tech
primer lugar,
innovation here that we've found in different
plataformas
areas
digitales.
within
Aquí
digital
nombro 3
platforms.
países que
Here, I want to
justo son
mention 3
vecinos, están en el Cono
countries
Sur y que son para
that are
destacar,
part of
como Brasil,
the
Argentina y
Northern
Uruguay,
Hemisphere,
y cómo
which
el
are
acceso
Brazil,
es
Argentina, and
posible
Uruguay,
inclusive
and
desde
how
el
they've made it
exterior,
possible
ante la
to
decisión
even
previa
overseas in
del
the face
desplazamiento.
of prior
Lo segundo, la
decisions
inteligencia
for
artificial,
displacement. They've been able to
cómo se
use
está en
tech.
una etapa
Second
muy
of all, we have the use
exploratoria
of AI.
de
As we know, it's
verificación
still
documental. Y aquí
something
quiero
that
destacar un
is
trabajo muy
being
fuerte que ha hecho
pioneered.
Chimea,
There's a
Italia,
lot of efforts there
que viene
provided by,
trabajando
for example,
justamente
Italy,
en el
Guinea, and
mapeo de
so
inteligencia
we want to
artificial en el
basically
uso
map
de
out
documentación
AI within the
verificada.
use
Y
of
después algunos
verifiable
riesgos que tienen las
documentation.
innovaciones
And there's also
tecnológicas,
some
los
risks as
sesgos,
well,
la
such as
transparencia
bias,
y la protección de datos.
transparency,
Siguiente, por
and
favor.
data protection. Next, please.
Aquí encontramos
Here we
una tabla que nos
run
muestra
into
los
a
marcos
table
normativos
which shows
nacionales.
us
Esta es
different
una visión
national norms
comparativa
and
que
frameworks.
pretende
It's more of
ser
a comparative table
exhaustiva de lo
vision,
que integra el
which
documento. Ahí
looks at what the
tomamos
document
algunos
basically is
países, como
about.
son
On
Argentina,
broad terms, we
Brasil,
look at different
Colombia,
countries such as
Jamaica, México,
Argentina, Brazil,
Perú,
Colombia,
República
Jamaica,
Dominicana y
Mexico,
Uruguay.
Peru,
Aquí
the
encontramos una
DR,
columna
and
de
Uruguay.
los marcos legales
Here,
principales que
we look
amparan a
at the
esos
main legal
países
framework that, of course,
para
covers
el
each respective
reconocimiento
country.
de cualificaciones. Algunos
Also looking at
son de
qualifications,
carácter muy
some are
jurídico que
very judicial
hay
in
que
nature,
trabajar fuertemente para
and we have to
buscar
work
un alineamiento
a
con
lot
algunas
to
pautas
find
regionales.
alignment
Otros
with it,
son un
along
poco
with
más amplios y
regional
muy alineados
bullet
con
points. Others are a bit
convenios
more,
tanto
let's
globales
say,
o
they're
global como
broader in
regionales.
scope and
¿Cuáles
have
son las últimas
different
actualizaciones? Buscamos también un mapeo
partnerships with
y
it. We
en
also
particular ahí
mapped out the
encontramos
different
los distintos años. Tenemos una fuerte corriente
years, and
post-pandémica
last
desde el
updates,
2021
we see
en
that they're
adelante
mainly
de
all
actualización de
post-pandemic
mucha
from
de la
2021
normativa. Y
upwards.
por último,
Looking again at
algunos
the
ejemplos de
updating
procedimientos
of the norms, and
adaptativos
again we look
que
at some
luego en los estudios de
procedures
caso vamos a
that are
profundizar.
adaptative in nature, which we'll look into later
Tomé
on.
algunos estudios de caso para la
I took
presentación de hoy.
some
En primer
case studies
lugar,
for today's
y vamos a
presentation.
tener el honor de
And
tener al
first of all, we'll
viceministro de
have the
Educación
honor of having
Superior,
the Vice
Ricardo,
Minister of
que puede hacer
Higher
algunos comentarios
Education,
más.
Ricardo,
Pero
who
el caso
will
de
add on
Colombia
to
es
some
muy
statements. But the case of
interesante porque
Colombia is
encontramos
very interesting because there
una
we
herramienta
find
fundamental para
tools that are
el proceso de
fundamental
reconocimiento de la
for
población
regarding
venezolana.
acknowledgement
Colombia
and
como
recon
país
of
vecino
Venezuelan
y
populations.
ante
With
la
Colombia being a
crisis de
neighboring
movilidad que está
country or sibling
teniendo
country,
Venezuela,
we
ha
see that it has
accionado
tended to
lo que es el permiso
Venezuela,
de
and there have
protección
been different
temporal, que justamente lo que
actions through
busca es
means
un
of
reconocimiento
a PPT
más
or TPS per its English
vinculante
acronyms.
de la situación venezolana para poder
Of course,
incorporar
helping
a
to cover more regarding the
esos
Venezuelan
habitantes que
situation,
están
and of course,
trasladándose al
being able to
país, que
cover for
muchos
that
llevaban
population
mucho
that has
tiempo
fled the
en el país
nation
colombiano
and
y
that
que
have
no estaban
stayed
pudiendo
in Colombia
acceder al
for quite some
reconocimiento de
time
sus
now,
trámites.
that have not been able
El
to
segundo
have an
punto, allí
acknowledged legal
tenemos a
status
Brasil.
as of now.
Brasil
Second, here we
tiene
have
primero
Brazil.
la
Brazil,
plataforma
first of all,
Bori,
has the
que
Bori
Carolina
platform.
Bori, que es una plataforma
Carolina Bori
que ha
is
permitido también
a
el
platform which has
contacto de la
allowed
población
for
refugiada con
contact amongst the refugee population
las
along
distintas
with
universidades. Hay algunas
different
acciones concretas
universities.
de
There's some
universidades
specific and
federales
concrete
que han
actions from federal
apoyado en el
universities that
proceso
have
idiomático.
supported
Recordemos que
everything
Brasil,
regarding the language barrier.
y sin parecer obvio, pero es
And
importante para
it may seem
todo el
obvious,
público que nos está
but
escuchando,
I mean, it's important for
de habla
everyone to know
portuguesa,
that in
recibe
Brazil,
mucha
because it
población
is a
que
Portuguese-speaking
habla
country,
española.
they
Por lo
still
tanto,
receive a lot
el
of
incorporarlos rápidamente al sistema de
Spanish-speaking
educación
populations,
superior
and
ha
so it's
sido un
important
desafío
that
y esa plataforma ha
we
colaborado mucho. Y
acknowledge how
luego
it's been a
la
challenge for higher
cátedra
education to
Sergio
get that
Viera de
language
Melo,
barrier
que
undone. And
es
then
un
we
hito,
want to
es
look
un
at
ejemplo que
everything
hoy
regarding
también se está trasladando a otros países
milestones
de la
here, how
región,
we
que son
look
buenas
through
prácticas,
other
buenas
countries in the
acciones,
region, how we have
acompañamiento y
good
sobre todo apoyo
practices and
psicosocial
overall
en el
psychosocial
proceso de
support
incorporación. Tenemos
within that procedure.
el tercer país que queríamos nombrar,
We
que es
also look at
México,
the
el
third nation here
apoyo
that I want to
documental
mention,
que
which is
realiza ACNUR
Mexico,
y
through
un
means of
fuerte impulso de
providing
la
support
sociedad
on
civil en general.
documentation with UNHCR
Recordemos que
and civil society.
este Estado
Let's remind
federal
ourselves
tiene
that it's a federal state that
distintas
has
situaciones al sur y
different
al norte,
situations,
en
both
algunos
to the
casos
north and to the
de
south,
emisión
in some
de
cases
población, en otros
regarding
casos de recepción, por lo tanto tiene
issuing
un
and
gran
reception
desafío.
of the
Siguiente,
migrant
por favor.
population with the vast challenges. challenge in front of it as well. Next, please.
Y aquí tenemos el caso de Argentina y
Here
cómo
we have the case of
la
Argentina,
aplicación máxima de la autonomía
how
universitaria ha
we have the
permitido que
use
ante
of,
distintas
well,
situaciones se
universities and its
tengan
autonomies to cover
diversas respuestas.
really
La autonomía universitaria, cada
situations
una
with different ranges of
de las
responses.
provincias argentinas con sus principales
We have, for
universidades
example,
han
the
tenido
Argentinian
varias respuestas
provinces that
y
have
ha
provided
permitido
different responses
incorporar
overall, and which
a
have allowed
población
for
migrante y en situación de
the
refugio
incorporation
con
of
escasez de
migrants and refugee
documentación, y ahí tenemos también
population
plataformas que
with
se
a
han llevado
lack of
adelante
documentation as
desde
well. We
el
have a
Ministerio
platform there.
de Educación, hoy en día
We
Secretaría
see
de
that with the
Educación en
Ministry of
Argentina,
Education and
a
of
la
course
hora
the
del
Secretariat of
reconocimiento.
Education as well
El caso de Uruguay con la
is
Comisión de
to take the
Refugiados
acknowledgement as
y
well. In the
el
case of
último
Uruguay,
proceso de
we have regarding
alineamiento
coverage
del
for
Ministerio de Educación y
the
Cultura
refugee
en cuanto a
population,
la
as well as the
digitalización de
Ministry of Education
documentación.
and
La
Culture when it comes
plataforma
to
que
digitalizing
maneja el
information.
Ministerio de Educación y
The
Cultura
platform
en
that
Uruguay
they manage in
permite
Uruguay
a muy bajos costos y con
allows
una rapidez
for
muy alta estar
low costs
alineado
and
a
quick
los
procedures
estándares del convenio
regarding
regional de
complying
Buenos Aires
standards
y el convenio
of
global,
regional areas
reconociendo y
such as the
permitiendo
Buenos Aires
una
one
rápida
and
inserción en el
global
mercado
framework as
laboral y
well.
un
Of course,
reconocimiento
having
de
a
cualificación.
positive acceptation
Tenemos el
to the
caso de
workforce
Perú
and
con la
qualifications.
Superintendencia
Then we go to
Universitaria
Peru with
Nacional de Educación
the
Superior, que
National
este caso que es más
University
reciente ha
Superintendents.
permitido
This is
también
more of
ante
a frequent case,
en la zona
and
pacífica, que
it
tiene
has
una movilidad muy
allowed in the
grande
Pacific area overall
de población refugiada,
to
está en
take
un
in the
proceso de
different refugee
adecuación
population.
de sus
It's
normativas y el
currently
trabajo de la
underway of
superintendencia ha sido
accommodating and
fundamental en este
finishing
proceso.
its final
Y por
touches
último, para
with the
nombrar
norms.
también nuestra
And finally,
región,
to also
al
mention the
Caribe, y
region,
ahí encontramos
want
una gran
to highlight the
fragmentación y
Caribbean. The
desigualdades. Hay
Caribbean
temas idiomáticos,
is,
hay temas
well,
de
it's pretty
escala y hay temas
unequal
también
and
de
broken there.
cercanía
We
con algunos
see
países
how
que
it
son
is
fuertes
close to
emisores
other
de
nations
refugiados y el volumen
that
que en
have
muchos casos no
treated
le
these
permite
migrant
trabajar
populations, but
adecuadamente.
the
Ahí
volume
tenemos
does not allow for
el
it to
caso,
work as successfully.
por ejemplo, de República Dominicana y
We have, for
cómo
example, the
desde
case
la
of the
sociedad
DR
civil y
and
Trinidad y
how
Tobago
from within
también,
civil
desde la
society,
sociedad
oh, we have
civil se ha hecho
Trinidad
un
and
apoyo
Tobago as well. We
fuertemente
want to
al
look at
proceso
how
de
they've had
reconocimiento.
support
Siguiente,
on
por favor.
everything regarding acknowledgement.
Llegando cerca de la conclusión
Moving on
de
to
este
the
documento, que
conclusion here
es un
for
reporte que
the,
tiene
for the documentation. It's part of a report
unas cuantas revisiones y tiene los
that's
estudios de
been
caso que vamos
revised
a estar
numerous
muy abiertos
times
a
and that has
recibir
different
las
study cases. We're
consultas y vamos a
open to look
recibir
at consultations, and we're
las
going to also
preguntas. De hecho,
receive
quiero
questions.
destacar
As a matter of
también la
fact,
respuesta que hemos
I want
tenido
to
de
highlight the different responses
CINALC
that
y
we've
en
had,
particular, ¿qué es eso? Es la red
looking at
de
everything
centros
regarding
nacionales de información de
that
América Latina y el Caribe,
Central
que nos ha
Information
dado
Network
respuesta
for
y nos
Latin
ha
America
dado
and the
mucha
Caribbean
información
that
de la
has had
situación
cross
en varios
responses
países.
as well
Estas
as
recomendaciones operativas van
tending to
en
it
3 líneas.
and nations
Primero,
as they
de
may
0
require.
a 6
It's
meses
separated
con
into 3 months of
trabajos
operation. First of
rápidos que
all, from
podrían
0 to
ser
6 months, we can call this the
avanzados por
quick
los distintos
work,
Estados miembros. Primero, el tener
which
protocolos
goes
mínimos
through
que
member
aseguren
nations.
el
They want
acceso
to
a la
make
educación
sure that
superior,
they can assure
que
access to the
permitan
network
una
and
gran reducción
information
de costos y que estén
through cost
alineados
reduction,
a
and that everything be
las buenas
aligned
prácticas internacionales.
to positive practices as
Segundo,
well.
ya entramos
Second of
en un
all, we
periodo de
would
mediano
now
plazo,
be
de 6
looking
a
at
18
everything
meses.
regarding
Quiero
6 to
destacar
18 months.
cómo los
I want to
mecanismos adaptativos
highlight
nacionales
the
que están
different
muy
national and
utilizados
adaptive mechanisms
en
that
regiones como la
are
europea,
utilized quite a lot
podrían ser en
through
algunos casos aplicados
the
teniendo
European Union, for
adaptaciones
example,
estructurales y
how we can
adaptaciones
have a
locales
cultural
a varios
adaptation
países. Estos mecanismos adaptativos
throughout different
implican
nations. These are mechanisms that, of
trabajar
course,
en una
imply
ampliación de los
working
equipos de reconocimiento a nivel
on
local,
widening
un
teams on a
trabajo
local level,
entre
as well
entre la
as
región, entre los distintos países que
having this
permita
work throughout the
que
region and different nations, which
se traslade buena parte de la
would
información
allow for
que están en
the
los
greater
países de
part of
origen y en los
information to be
países de
moved
recepción,
upon
y la
through
interoperabilidad
member
digital, el
nations, and of
permitir
course
que
having
hoy en día
digital
desde una
interoperational
baja conexión a Internet
features.
se puede acceder
For
a
example,
el
even if you
ingreso
have
de
low bandwidth,
documentación,
you
al
can
reconocimiento y
access
a la
documentation,
corrección de muchas veces
as well as
documentación
revision and
que muchas
correction of
veces
documentation
los
that
equipos
many
terminan
times
trabajando al respecto. Y después, por último,
different
en
teams
un
may
plazo
have.
de
And
mediano a largo plazo,
finally,
estamos hablando de 2
well,
a
in the mid
5
to
años,
long term, we're talking 2 to 5 years,
deberíamos estar buscando
we
políticas regionales
should
comunes.
look
Ahí
for
hay un
common
trabajo del
policies on a regional
Comité
scale,
Ejecutivo
looking
del
at everything
Convenio
regarding
Regional de Buenos Aires,
committees
al que tengo el
as
honor
well
de presidir,
as
y que tenemos un
agreements, as is the
apoyo
case of
no
Buenos
solamente de
Aires,
UNESCO IESALC
and that
en
we
la
have
región, sino
support
a
there,
nivel global
not just
por
throughout the
parte del
region,
área de
but on a
educación
global scale,
superior,
through
con
means of higher
el
education,
director Chakroun y todo su equipo,
with Director Chakroun
para
and his
poder
entire
buscar
staff and
políticas
team,
regionales que
so that we
sean
can
comunes,
have
que sean
regional
accesibles
policies
y que
that
sean al
can
final
be
del día
accessible and
puestas en
that at the end of the
foco
day
para
can
quienes trabajamos todos los días, que son al
focus
final del
on
día los habitantes
that
de
which
nuestros
we work
países. Y por
every single
último,
day.
destacar
Finally,
la
we want
integración
to
y el
highlight
trabajo
integration and
de tanto
work
CINALC como Recolatin, que son
of
dos
CINALC
redes
as
importantes en la
Colatin,
región.
which are two
CINALC,
vital
con
networks
los
in the
pocos años
region.
de vida que tiene, ha
For
trabajado
as young as
en
they are,
integrar no
since they were
solamente a los
established,
países que han
they've done a
ratificado el
lot for the
convenio
nations,
regional,
and they've
sino
also
a
ratified
instituciones,
both
agencias
regional agreements
y
as well as
estados
institutions,
que
agencies, and
tienen
states
mucho para aportar y
that
que
have a lot to
dejan un
give
poco de lado la
and
burocracia de
that
pronto que pueda ser política
leave
y
bureaucracy at the
coyuntural
door,
para pasar
having a more of a
el
joint
verdadero
effort
objetivo
to
que
then
es
pass on to, of course, achieving
que
results of
más personas
on the
accedan
objective,
a la
which
educación
is to make
superior.
sure
Siguiente.
higher education.
Por último, algunas reflexiones
finally,
para este cierre y
just
ateniéndome
some
al tiempo y a los comentarios que
reflection
puedan
on the closing
surgir.
statements
El
here.
primero, el entender que
First
el
of all,
reconocimiento de
something regarding
cualificaciones
acknowledgement
es
of
una restitución
qualifications.
de
That
derechos.
is to, of
Esto
course,
está
be
signado en buena
able
parte
to
de los documentos
reinstate different rights,
que nos
as well
enmarcan
as
en el trabajo
look at the
y que en
different
definitiva debería estar
points of
más
framework that
claro, más
should be
establecido por los
clear
hacedores de
or more
política pública, los
permissive,
tomadores de decisión.
especially in the face of
En
decision
segundo
making.
lugar, esto es una
And
oportunidad
second of all,
estratégica
we
para los
have
sistemas
the
de
strategic
educación
opportunity
superior. Hay
for
varios
different
estudios que
systems in
demuestran no
higher education,
solamente cómo el
looking not
reconocimiento de
just at
cualificaciones tiene un
having
impacto
that acknowledgement, for
positivo en el
example, of
PBI de los
different
países, tiene un impacto
grades or
positivo en
qualifications,
sectores
different nations, but that also
de
different
la industria
sectors
que de pronto no están tan
within
desarrollados y que hay un
industries
aporte muy grande. Y tercero,
in
algunos
And third of all,
empujes de diversidad cultural y
of
de buenas
course,
prácticas
calling
a la
for
hora de
positive
relaborar.
practices
Y
and greater
por
diversity of
último,
thought
un llamado a la
in
acción,
different
un
fields.
call
And
to
finally, a
action
call to
que
action
vendría a ser
itself.
de pasar de las
Call to
normas que
action,
ustedes
which of
habrán visto que
course
son
is to
muy
have
variadas,
the
son muy
norms, as you can see,
diversas,
they
a
are
una
quite
implementación
varied,
concreta,
and that we can
tener
have it
casos
move on to a
de
full
éxito que
implementation,
puedan servir como
having
ejemplo para los
success cases
distintos países, abre muchas
established.
puertas, muestra
It
una luz en
opens
el
many doors,
horizonte
it
y al final
shows
del
a
día
light through the
permitiría
horizon,
que
and at the end of the
nuestros
day, it would
países
also allow for
tengan una
us
mayor
and our
recepción
nations
de
to
esa
have
población
a
que tanto
greater
necesita
reception,
de nuestro abrazo, nuestra
look at
acogida y
everything that
por ende
is
el
required,
reconocimiento de
as
sus
well as
cualificaciones.
acknowledgement of those
Cerrando
qualifications.
y pasando a la
So
siguiente
with this,
slide,
we shall pass on to the final slide.
quería agradecerles
I just
profundamente por
wanted
ese
to
trabajo,
thank
reiterar en
everyone
apoyo
for
de
everything
nuestro
regarding
director
support,
Chakroun, que ha
Director
tenido la
Chakroun,
gentileza de conectarse
who has
en
been kind
vivo
enough to
a esta
connect
presentación.
live
Muchas
to the
gracias por
presentation as well.
por este
Thank
proceso.
you
Quiero
very
destacar
much.
también
I want to
todos
also
los integrantes del
highlight
panel
everything
que ahora nos
regarding
ponemos a disposición para las
all
preguntas
the members of the audience
que
and
van
the
a ir
panel. Thank you
surgiendo
for being here,
y también hacer
as
un
well as
reconocimiento
future
al
members, and to
director
also
saliente
have
Francés
an
Pedro que tuvo la
acknowledgement
visión de
on
aportar en esta área
Director
que
Better, who also
era
added on
muy
to this
incipiente en
framework
cuanto a información. Así que
regarding
esperemos haber
information.
aportado a
So
los
we
escuchas,
hope that
los
we
que
could
luego
have
puedan ver la
added on
grabación y a los
to
distintos
different
tomadores de
struggle, as well
política
as
pública, tomadores de
everything
decisión de
regarding
política
decision
pública, que esto
makers
les haya servido.
being able to
Muchas
see
gracias
this,
y
as
estoy
well
a
as
las
public
órdenes.
policies being implemented. Thank you once again very much.
Gracias, Baron.
Muchas gracias, Gonzalo, por esta valiosa
Thank you very much,
presentación.
Gonzalo, for
Y
this
ahora me gustaría
valuable
invitar a nuestro
presentation. And
primer
now I would like to
panelista,
welcome
Ricardo
our
Moreno, el
first panelist,
viceministro
Ricardo
de
Moreno, Vice
Educación
Minister
Superior
of
de
of
Colombia,
Higher
para
Education
que nos
in
comparta la
Colombia,
perspectiva
so he
de su
can share
país
with
sobre
us
este
the
tema.
perspectives of his
Ricardo,
country.
adelante.
So with this, Ricardo, the floor is yours.
No, it seems that we don't have Ricardo connected with us yet. Therefore, Manal, if you don't mind, I will pass the floor to you as the first panelist. Manal Stulgaitis is the higher education lead at UNHCR, who has been supporting us with the preparation of this study. Manal, the floor is yours.
Marvelous. Thanks so much, Vanja. Gonzalo, many congratulations to you. As you know, I mean, I have many things to say about the study, but really having seen the presentation of the findings again, I'm really struck by the depth and the value that this report brings to the field of refugee higher education. And so our gratitude is to you and of course to all the colleagues in the leadership at UNESCO that made this study possible. And I should take a step back, that even identified that this report and this study needed to happen in the Latin America region and could contribute so massively to the work that we do. So starting at the beginning, again, my name is Manal Stulgaitis. I lead on higher education for the UN Refugee Agency. As you know, and I think Gonzalo touched on many of these important points, but we're at an extreme high in terms of global displacement. And while I won't go through the detail of the figures, what I really want to highlight on is that amongst the 123 million displaced people and the approximately 38 million refugees under the UNHCR mandate, amongst them, roughly 4 million are young people of university-going age. Now, that's a huge number of young people who are disrupted right in the moment of their individual development, of their opportunities to build knowledge, begin the path to acquire qualifications, be part of vibrant university campuses, whether in person or online. And this is an incredible disruption to, of course, to their lives, but more so to the long-term trajectory of their own personal development and their ambitions to contribute to the world. So I think that all of us on this call are probably here for a reason, and that is that we share many of these ideas and these understandings. But to the point of qualifications recognition, where the report highlights that the real challenges around having academic qualifications and prior learning validated and recognized is one of the primary barriers to access. I mean, A, this is alarming, but B, it should give us hope, because the study shows us that it can be overcome. That these many different examples of the individual countries are showing how to solve this problem, that this problem can be solved in different ways, with technical solutions, with regulatory adjustments, with policy repositioning, with the individual autonomy and flexibility of higher education institutions. So we see that there's not only one pathway to expanding access, but there are many pathways to recognizing that this challenge can be overcome. So I wanted to recognize also three of the things, or at least two or three of the things that Gonzalo said. One is that this idea of having a common solution. And what I want to recognize is that when Gonzalo and Vanja first presented the findings of the report to us, what really astonished and astounded me was how much this information desperately needed to be shared with other regions. So while we're very much in the Latin America region right now and in this context, the application and the example that some of these countries can offer to other refugee hosting locations is profound. And so this is not a report of limited validity or relevance. There really is an opportunity for us to take this one report, all of the learnings that arose from it, and do more of it. And so I'm leaning into UNESCO here and hoping that the colleagues at UNESCO will go with us hand in hand to expanding this work beyond the region. This is really the expertise of UNESCO and where they've added so much value. The other piece is, of course, the accessibility. Overly technical solutions, overly expensive solutions, solutions that are not fit for purpose in a rapidly evolving situation are not going to solve the problem. And so I think that this was highlighted, that these have to be realistic, accessible solutions, and that result in efficiencies, in overall efficiencies in the system, right? That make the transition from prior learning through displacement into continuation of education more efficient. And then, of course, this applies equally to the world of work, where you have, credentials that can be more efficiently recognized, leads to more rapid transition into what we term self-reliance for refugees, for people who are experiencing displacement. And all of this cumulatively, as I think Gonzalo said very eloquently, leads to the ultimate goal, which is greater access, which is trying to ensure that we achieve not only the 15% of refugees enrolled in higher education by 2030, which is our goal, but beyond that, and that we see the benefits of higher education becoming very accessible, becoming widely accessible, and not hindered by barriers such as recognition that we've shown and have seen can be overcome. So I am going to stop there with thanks again to the organizers for including us, to the report drafters and Gonzalo for all the work in addressing this important issue that has so much bearing on the work that we do at UNHCR. With that, Vanja, I will pass back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manal, for your intervention and for the cooperation extended to UNESCO as a whole. It's an area of key importance to us, and as our director mentioned in the beginning, an area that as an organization we would like to continue our cooperation on. Ahora me gustaría invitar a Ricardo Moreno.
I'll now pass it over to Ricardo Moreno, Vice Minister of Higher Education in Colombia. Thank you, Ricardo, for joining us this morning. And thank you for sharing with us the Colombian perspective on higher education. Ricardo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Vanja, and special greetings to all of you. I'm sending you fraternal remarks and fraternal greetings from Colombia. I see some familiar faces on screen, and I think that we've gotten to share some opportunities. I'm glad to see Francisco, and I'm glad to see many of you. Thank you for this opportunity. And once again, I'd like to express my gratitude to UNESCO for having us as the national government of Colombia in order to share with you this country experience in terms of qualification. We have, as a government, we truly believe in the strengthening of the human capacities, which is something that goes beyond sectors, but will enable us to mobilize a state policy. We try to articulate from the Colombian experience and trying to articulate the educational sector together with the productive sectors and the labor market, and also with different communities at different territories, which is going to provide us with a new approach of territorial development, having in mind this qualification experience. This has got some specific background that are sitting within the Colombian legislation. We have some regulations that are called COMPES that have to do with the social and economic development by territories in the country. And the most recent were issued back in 2010, which is, let's say, 1.5 decades ago, and where we had some specific regulations set, and then we issued during Gustavo Petro's administration, we had an update to that regulation. And this regulation advanced on how we could train people for work opportunities. In that sense, we have consolidated some sort of a long-term pathway that is considering the qualification framework that we have in the country. And this, of course, represents the structural commitment of the administration in order to see this qualification, this acknowledgement of qualifications, that it comes together with a national development plan, and that at the same time mandates education as a common axe to bridge some gaps, specifically for those people that are, and for those of you who are familiar with the Colombian history, this is only translated not only in the Colombian armed conflict, but also the way that the displaced population have played a key role in the development of our country, and how we can actually provide them with access to equitable education. So that's why we have tried to come up with this framework of qualifications. This has enabled us to keep on working on the qualification system that we have, with very clear pathways, with a participatory approach, where we are going to have in mind the national framework of qualifications that is going to ensure that all of the different stakeholders of the educational system can actually respond in a more pertinent way to the needs not only of the country, but the territories at the local level. And in that sense, we have a very interesting pathway, which is the mobility scheme by the 3 different routes or pathways of mobility in the country. And in that sense, we need to acknowledge something that is very important, that is the diversity of learning approaches. Because here we're trying to acknowledge different backgrounds that are responding to the territorial needs. In terms of advances, I'd like to share with you that we have developed 19 over 26 qualification pathways. And right now we have engaged more than 123 educational institutions where we're all working within this qualification system. And most of these qualifications have to do with different fields of knowledge. And in that sense, we have provided some guidelines and some methodological pathways in order to do this vocational training and human development training at work sites, which is an approach that Colombia has developed and that is focused on the development of qualifications. And in that sense, we're also working towards having programs, national programs with social occupational lines of work, having in mind their abilities or the former skills that people may have. So in that sense, we have advanced. We have made some progress with the mobility processes with multiple countries in Latin America and in the Caribbean, which also helps us out to transit through a regional framework of qualifications that might be very useful for the current human mobility situation in the region. Within this scheme, we have identified 5 principles that have some technical content, but also political content. The first one has to do with educational and social justice, where we need to acknowledge former knowledge as a way to dignify millions of workers, of people who have been displaced, that do not have a formal diploma, but they do have empirical knowledge, which is truly valuable for the personal and productive development of the community where they live. The second one has to do with innovation. Every day we continue to incorporate in a more direct way the digitization and the technological transition that we have in our qualification system. And here we're trying to promote systems that are adaptable to this technology of knowledge by using a common language of technification, which is very important because thanks to the national framework that we have established, we have managed to establish some bridges between the educational component, the labor component, and the community component. So in that sense, as I said before, we try to work in this connection. So we have seen a challenge as a country, which is the institutional articulation and the governance that this system requires, this qualification system requires, and the consensus amongst different sectors. For example, for the Colombian case, there is an articulated work that we have completed between the Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of Education, but we also need to articulate what we do with other agencies, with other state agencies and community agencies. And this has been something that has been reinforced through a specific process or plan that we have here, which is an empathetic system towards the higher education that is going to enable us by having, let's say, that by incorporating new theories in order to incorporate more and more new agencies. And then as the fifth element, inclusion and the territorial equity that is part of this system. And we also need to have a specific tool in order to democratize access to education, specifically to those populations who have been historically excluded or historically vulnerable. For example, the people in the rural situation of our country. And just like what you said before in terms of migrants and refugees, that, for example, in the Colombian case has been welcomed initially in a very strong way by the educational system. In that sense, and within the regional context, as a country, Colombia sees this as an opportunity to build on new partnerships, and we work on the Pacific partnership, and we work in the drafting of the regional framework regional higher education framework, and we're working as well with tourism and other endeavors in order to find new tools for us to have these comparability tools in terms of what we have in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we've had great articulation in that sense. And of course, here we are in line with the policy of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, with objective number 4 and 8, to which we are committed to having an inclusive education, in as much as having an agenda that is going to help us out to work on, let's say, common objectives with UNESCO, the OES, and other organizations. And so we can contribute from our side with that. And I would like to conclude by saying that the Colombian experience has been a very enriching one. And it is also part of this project of a country that we have. We acknowledge the richness and the diversity of knowledge that many people may have, and our commitment is deeply rooted into fostering those sorts of knowledges. And actually last week we were talking about, we've been working on energy transition and some other things, and this is nothing but a proof of how interested we are into having this regional conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for sharing everything regarding Colombia's progress, as well as its enormous contributions to today's topic. Up next, I'll pass the floor to my colleague, Francisco Contreras, Senior Assessor of Credentials in Switzerland, as well as Secretary of Information Management in Latin America and the Caribbean. Francisco, welcome. Thank you, Vanja. First of all, I want to provide a congratulations that's in order to Gonzalo Baroni for a great effort. I truly believe that it, along with joint efforts with everything that is being done right now on a global scale regarding acknowledgement, as well as everything regarding treating refugees and displaced persons, I think it's important to be able to make sure that we can place that discussion on the table and we can talk about positive practices as well as the work that we've done throughout the region. I also believe that it is necessary to state the highlight that all these efforts have, that while true that we're looking and discussing at it constantly, we start applying it as well through positive practices as stated with Gonzalo. And I just want to say that this is a context that is pretty new when it comes to everything regarding acknowledgement on higher education, because everything regarding migration areas and refugees and displaced persons, it's not something new for Latin America and the Caribbean. Before, we were a region that received a lot of migration, especially from Europe and, well, other areas as a whole. And we also are the second region in the world when it comes to the ranking with immigration. Throughout the end of the 19th century and in the 20th century, it was the second region that had the greatest amount of migration influx overall. And in 1914, 1/3 of the population was actually foreign. And so it means that we've had experience beforehand when it comes to taking in migrants as well as refugees. Central America has always had a vast migration influx that is noticeable, as established by Gonzalo as well. Another important moment in time as well there was looking at the 70s with military dictatorships, especially in the Southern Cone, and we saw how many people fled as refugees. Many of them didn't go for Europe or the US, but for example, Mexico. Mexico took in many people, not just from Chile, but throughout the entire Southern Cone as a whole. And also, for the Vice Minister of Colombia, there was a huge influx of migrants as well. due to the internal conflict that Colombia's had to have and persist. And we see that it's not just about this country. We all see how many Colombians went, for example, to Venezuela and otherwise. So basically, the topics, everything has to do with refugees, it's not something that's new to us. I believe that what may be new and what is necessary to speak about more is the way in which we can work together along with refugees and displaced persons. Now, in regard to, for example, acknowledgement of credentials, degrees, academics, and professionals as a whole. So basically, why is it that beforehand, when we had the first Latin American and Caribbean Convention for acknowledgement back in '74, why did everything regarding refugees and displaced persons, it wasn't maybe as, let's say, it wasn't as highlighted, so to speak. That's important to state as well. But I would say that the fundamental topic has to do with development and progress on higher education. For example, globalization within the system itself. Nowadays, higher education plays a very important role in the job market compared to that of 50 or 60 years ago. There's also a greater necessity on behalf of countries and employers alike, and there's also a greater offer for higher education and the job market that is present, and we of course have to do something with that. We've created strategic opportunities for the continent and for the region to strengthen the work and education relations as it is jointed along with people that maybe have had higher education in other parts of the region. It's also worth highlighting, it was stated that we look at the integration and starting of refugees within the job market in a different nation or in the receiving or host nation. That's important. As discussed before, the idea is that we can look at, for example, academic qualifications for refugees and displaced persons, as that represents an obligation of sorts within a framework. It's not a bad thing. On the contrary, it's not just saying, okay, it exists within the different framework. There's also rights involved. And the last thing is that there's a necessity to have more accurate tools in order to assess credentials as well as professional diplomas on that of foreigners. There's a demand on the job market, yes, but also for employers to, of course, look at positive practices, knowledge, and to have more efficient procedures done. Now, some reflections regarding these technical aspects, which I completely agree with, and I'm happy that we are working on it as well in this regard. I believe that, first of all, it is important that we take the documentation, obstacles, and structures that one way or the other impede for foreigners to be able to continue studying in the nation, in the receiving nation at that, and that they can also not have limitations within the job market. It's important to be able to know what obstacles are set forth so we can fight against them. I also believe that it is well, very accurate within the documentation to split up the different measures and methods in both the short, mid, and long term. I don't think we're currently in the conditions of doing everything per se, but I think it's important that we can look at what we can do right now in the moment and within what time frame. And it was established as well with Gonzalo Baroni, and the other panelists have stated it as well. It's important to continue working on specific and concrete action. It's not possible or efficient that each and every one of our nations has their own tools, their own strategies, because we have regional common policies, to have them be more selective. For example, everything regarding mobility in higher education is something that is not internal, but more national and international alike. And so we need to make sure that we can have regional common ground in norms. Of course, looking at efforts on a global scale. And just to come to a close here, I want to state 3 things that have to do with work. The first one is acknowledgement. But before that, I also believe it is important that we have a distinction issued forth for the documentation, stating that it is important to highlight, for example, the regulatory processes that we have when it comes to verifying and invalidating foreign degrees, that it be a procedure exclusive to those that carry a refugee status or displaced person status. I mean, within the higher education world, it's not the same. And such acknowledgement of those credentials would allow for them to have a status that, of course, would have a specific and precise requirements. It's not something that we can just say and determine as the same thing. No, we need to make sure that there are different techniques and mechanisms set forth so we understand what we're talking about. In that regard, I'd also like to state, first of all, that as of now, well, we have different procedures and techniques for acknowledgement that are being set forth, directed for refugees and displaced persons, I'd say basically on a global stage. Of course, we can't look at the entire world, such as, for example, Africa, but that's something the European Union is looking at quite a lot. We also look at it through Asia, and it's important that, again, Latin America and the Caribbean have its participation on stage through means of different participation in tactics. And what I want to highlight as well is that we do need to develop our own procedures and tools. And we need to look at how the displaced persons are being afflicted. It's important to, of course, understand and know our context, looking at possibilities, and I believe that we can gather experiences from other regions. I completely agree on that. I think it's also important that we can develop procedures that are proper to that of what we already have. That is something that must be understood as something that is efficient, because if we do it another way, then we'll just be repeating the same old stories of technical failures and procedures that are not compatible with the region, because either we don't have the resources or there's not experience, or even refugees and displaced people are persons fall into another category. So as Gonzalo stated, for example, the language barrier, for example, for European nations, that is a huge barrier because no, we don't all speak the same language. Latin America overall, and well, Latin America as a majorly speaking, a Spanish-speaking region doesn't have that issue, but it's important to understand it as well. The other thing is that we must, of course, develop our own tools based on our availability and resources. I believe that there's no one-size-fits-all procedure for us. It's important that we look at what specific context would be applicable. And also, just to come to close here, I think it is important and necessary that we work even more based on institutional training. I think that it's not enough to work with and develop trainings on a national level, but it's also necessary that we talk to one another, that we can share the different practices that we have, that we can learn from one another, but that we can also share our efforts through technical reports. I think it's a great step forward. We need to better understand different regional systems so we can, of course, apply this, and that they can, of course, be directed toward displaced persons as well as refugees. With that, I also want to say that, well, one of the main things here is that we can come to a regional understanding through integration, in this case on the Buenos Aires Agreement. There are a few nations that have integrated in that regard, but I think it's an ability that we come together, and also that we look at those efforts for Latin America and the Caribbean, where we are, let's say, working in this regard for the same objective with different institutions, different governments, different acknowledgements as well. And we look at nations that have been integrated into the network, where we're, as a matter of fact, working for institutional training. We're also searching for common policies and positive policies. Thank you. Thank you, Francisco, for your excellent contribution and support overall when it comes to the actual creation and development of the report. So we shall now open the floor for the Q&A session, or if you have any statements, anything you want to say, please go ahead and write it. You have the Q&A option here. We have a question here for you, Gonzalo. Looking at accreditation systems, such as in the case of the Southern Cone, do you think that could be an issue for the implementation in the case of the Buenos Aires agreement? Well, first of all, thank you to Manal, Francisco, Ricardo for their interventions. You've been very generous, all of you, and you've all, from a very first moment in time, have been able to work on it in a joint manner. Now, I believe that in another regard, in the case of the Southern Cone Hemisphere and well, all associated members, one way or another, it could be facilitated as long as we look at the specific cases of refugees and that it does not harshen the process on acknowledgement. I think that the situation it's been pretty prevalent here, and we look at it, for example, for progress countries, others still have yet to progress, but I think it's important that we look and determine at it when we want to look at qualifications. I have many inquiries left, yes, but specifically they're aimed at refugees. I don't have that information on me on detail. Or in detail in this case, I can't mention, for example, a specific topic or chapter in that regard, but in broad terms, migration, qualifications, and otherwise, I think that the Southern Cone is pretty much the most advanced in the region, but it's not necessarily just for refugees.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. Given that we don't have any other questions, then we might encourage this discussion maybe with Manal.
To come in. Maybe if you can say a few words about UNHCR's education 15% by 2030 initiative, and also what kind of implications this has for Latin America and the Caribbean.
Sure, happy to, Vanya. Thank you for the question. First of all, for those who are not familiar with the 15 by 30, at least beyond what either Gonzalo or myself have said today, I will give us just a short introduction to show you how we've progressed. So in 2019 was the first cataloging of refugee enrollment in higher education. And at that point, the global figure stood at 1%, which we know is dramatically behind the global enrollment figure for non-refugees, which in that time has increased from around 41% to now just over 50%. And similarly, over that time, refugee enrollment has progressively increased. So we saw a jump from 1% to 3% and then 5%. And I just wanted to recognize that as of the Global Education Report from UNHCR that was released several weeks ago, the global figure now stands at 9%. So there has been an increase. And again, it's not accidental. It's because of the very, very hard work that all partners around the world have been doing, first and foremost, to recognize the fact that higher education is very much an issue and a challenge in situations of forced migration, of displacement, of refugee emergencies, right? So that was the first challenge, undoubtedly, was really noting that higher education does have a place, and a very important place, in emergency response or in humanitarian situations. The second piece is that the recognition of the work that higher education institutions in countries that host large numbers of refugees has largely been unrecognized, or less visible, I should say. And so this has been the second really substantive piece of the work, is recognizing and acknowledging that higher education institutions in places, especially like Colombia, Mexico, Ecuador, etc., but also Zambia, Uganda, Thailand, Bangladesh, higher education institutions are extremely engaged. There's a huge ethical and moral imperative to be involved in expanding access to higher education for refugees, and noting that all university actors, mostly, are seeking greater diversity and greater richness in the academic community on their campuses, and really do believe in this concept of inclusion and of the fact that higher education is part of the right to education. So over the past 5 years, as I said, refugee participation in higher education has grown from 1% today to 9%. In the Latin America and Caribbean region, as in other regions, we see vast differences between enrollment levels in countries, and that is obviously to be expected. There's no expectation that the rate of enrollment for displaced people should be any higher than young people who are nationals of these host countries. So in Latin America and the Caribbean, we see anywhere from 2% all the way to 12% of refugees and displaced students and youth being enrolled in higher education. Now, when it comes down to an average, we see that it does hover below 9%, and indeed often below 7%. But I can say confidently that there is progress being made. And from the UNHCR side, we are definitely seeing more universities come into the light in terms of saying, this is how we are including refugees, by recruiting students in refugee hosting areas, by waiving fees that would normally apply to international students and therefore apply to refugee or displaced students. And then by, of course, enacting flexibility when it comes to recognition of academic qualifications. So let's be optimistic and really focus on the fact that progress is being made. But then let's also recognize that this first 8% gain is probably the easiest part of the 10-year goal that has been set. And that now it really does take action, identifying incentives, finding common cause across regions. As we were saying, many of the colleagues on the call saying that there are examples set here that others can learn from, and that we can learn from the ways that other countries are successfully including refugees in higher education. But so this is the mission. The mission is now to continue to build on the lessons learned, to continue to see that global enrollment rate creep up. And then, of course, perhaps even the harder part, and Francisco was alluding to some of this, is then seeing the follow-on benefits of higher education and skills acquisition, which is participation in the labor market, entrepreneurial activity, building businesses, being part of formal wage employment. But all of this rests on the shoulders of quality education. I think that in there are several different calls to action, but in this context, I would point two calls of action to the higher education community. One is, let's recognize what higher education institutions are already doing. And in this, I would include higher level TVET, or technical and vocational education institutions. And then let's also encourage more higher education institutions to get involved. Because the other thing higher education institutions are great at is influencing government. And, and we heard from the government of Colombia earlier that, there is so much political will in this direction. But we also have to be able to show the results, the positive results and the outcomes of investments in this area. So this is what we're working on, and what we invite, more partners certainly to join this work and join the community. So thanks, Vanja.
Thanks to you, Manal, and it's also encouraging to know that the figure has grown to 9%. Although not much, it's still substantial improvement. Francisco, una pregunta para ti y después una pregunta para ti y para Gonzalo. Desde la perspectiva de un evaluador de credenciales.
From the perspective of the credential evaluator, what are some of the highest challenges that you have to face when assessing these qualifications on the technical level? And then for Francisco and Gonzalo, what mechanisms could be there in order to harmonize the recognition policies in the region? Vanja, I'm sorry, I couldn't get your question. I couldn't get the question. Could you please repeat it? I'm sorry. It's on me. I have an issue with my computer. But the first question goes for you. From the perspective of a credential evaluator, what are some of the highest challenges when evaluating the applications of these refugees at the technical level? And then another question for you and Gonzalo. What role may different mechanisms as CINALC may play in the harmonization of recognition policies throughout the region? Yeah, okay. So I think that the three main issues that we face is, one, of course, the lack of documentation. That might be the key issue that refugees may have, because they don't have the documents that's required from them, for example, their diplomas or their transcripts, their academic transcripts and so on. So that is usually an issue for us to assess a credential, for us to recognize any sort of qualification. And then we need to have some differentiation between migrants, refugees, and displaced population, because oftentimes, depending on their, let's say, on their situation, they may request this information back from their home country, whereas refugees and displaced population, they may not ask for that information. And the second aspect has to do with the credential itself, because sometimes we have issues with, let's say, the aspect that there is some missing information, some issues with translation, some translation issues for us to find an equivalent. And then the third one has to do with the information that we need to have from the home countries. For example, in this case, we need to know if X university or X higher education institution is a duly recognized institution in their home country, in order to, let's say, to prove that these programs are valid and that are duly, let's say, recognized in their country, because oftentimes these programs must be valid in their home country. So that's why, as refugees, and again, as refugees, they may access to that information, but for displaced people, for the displaced population, it is not possible for them to actually get a hold of the home country, of the higher education institution in their home country. So those are the three main issues that we face. Thank you very much, Francisco. And now, Gonzalo, I'll pass it over to you. I think that the network that moves over information in collaboration with some specific cases are absolutely key. And that's one of the, let's say, success components that the European scenario has had, for example, with the Lisboa Convention, where they're working together with American countries. And I think that in that sense, the digital interoperability is key. Having joint databases so we can share all information, it's going to make their work easier for evaluators. And in that sense, our Latin American and Caribbean networks are, let's say, overcoming this formalization stage. And now we're working on deepening the way that we share information and the way that we strengthen our cooperation, going beyond the political situations of each country. And in that sense, we also need to create this let's say, this culture to share more information. And I think that in the medium term, we may have, let's say, a satisfactory response to what we need to do.
Question to all three panelists of the webinar. It's a two-part question. The first is, how do you see the role of civil society in helping facilitate the recognition of qualifications for refugees and displaced persons? And on the other hand, and you all touched upon this to some extent, how do you see the role of technology in facilitating these processes?
Vanya, perhaps I can begin and then
Yeah.
and then pass to my colleagues who are much more on the technical side of recognition's work. So in terms of civil society, I think there was, if I read correctly, there was also a question in the chat about civil society's role in the global endeavor to increase access to higher education. And I think that's where I can come in. We see a lot of contribution from civil society organizations in several ways. So one on the academic side, where there is significant work done to support refugee youth and students and other, we can include other displaced youth who are making the transition from secondary education into, or preparing for the transition into higher education. So where there are no formal bridging programs, language was recognized, where there are additional prerequisites or requirements that need to be addressed, civil society is oftentimes stepping in to fill that role. And that happens for several reasons. One is where there is no national system in place to do that sort of formal transition support. The other, of course, is where young people lack the social capital to be able to navigate those systems and identify the services that are available to them. And this is often the case with displaced populations where, young people have left so much behind, and in a new environment, often a large urban environment, navigating those systems requires a lot of local knowledge that they're simply lacking for the first few years of displacement. And civil society organizations very strongly step in to fill that role. The other place where there's a huge role for civil society to play is in supporting young people to mobilize and to organize themselves. And this could be for several purposes. One could be to share information and to build those social networks. The other would be to, for sure, sharing information, I would just highlight as a really, really important function and often overlooked because it is such an informal, organic sort of process. But in terms of accessing information about higher education opportunities, about how to navigate those systems, so much of that is being passed between peers. And civil societies organizations are often there to support and provide that structure, provide places for young people to come together and learn about education opportunities, figure out where they fit in, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it is a very organic process. And then the last place that I would say, and this is more specific on civil society, is in faith-based institutions, where there is also, I would say, a substantial footprint of faith-based institutions who really recognize and value this charge to increase access to education and are able to play similar roles, either creating pathways for young people to to finish or complete their secondary education and move into higher ed, or to build communities around them that allow them to have more stable footing and then consider transitions into education or into work. But for the technical aspects, I would pass over to Francisco or to Gonzalo.
Bueno, Gonzalo, empiezo yo. ¿Sí? Bueno.
Okay, so I'll get started. So very briefly, I'd say that from the technical point of view, we have, let's say, opened an important, let's say, pathway for opportunities with the development of digital platforms and different digital tools for us to recognize or to do this evaluation, to conduct this evaluation process with all of the different international qualifications. And right now in Latin America and the Caribbean, if not all, almost all of us are working towards having any sort of digital platform that has, of course, facilitated the work of evaluation on credentials. And there is at least 5 countries where there is a platform where we, as providers of credentials, can actually query on and we can confirm whether the individual who's requested a certain evaluation actually has any sort of accreditation, any sort of diploma. So that's what we've done at the regional level with different institutions of higher education, and also with those programs that are already recognized at the state or the level or the country level, and that also need this sort of support. So we're working towards having these platforms at the national level, and together with CINALC, we're trying to work together in order to incorporate these different digital platforms that have, let's say, help us out to facilitate what we do in order to, first of all, to verify that this is not forged documents or anything like that. And so they can comply with the national regulations of their host country. And so we can access, let's say, information at a different level through different countries. So we're trying to use these digital, let's say, tools.
Well, on my behalf, I don't really have much to add to my fellow panelists. What I can say is that the region must work in further detail and maybe have the qualification acknowledgement process be more commonplace within higher education, not just to the corresponding bodies, agencies, or ministries, but also universities. Understand that many times these procedures that are being done, the way they are is common, and as a matter of fact, the work that's been done must be worked toward even more. And well, the idea that we work without being, trying to take the higher authority or morale ground. The idea that, of course, we can have structures set forth, in this case for migrant structures, and others, again, for decisions that may be implemented. Thank you very much.
Gracias a ti. Thank you to all of you for your contributions today, and for the audience for all the questions and the useful comments. We are slowly coming to the end of this webinar, but this is a topic that we will continue to treat with priority from UNESCO IESALC, and also work together with member states from the region and our network of information centers, CINALC. I would also like to let you know that today the study is available on IESALC's website, both in its original Spanish version, but also in English. And we invite you to consult it and come to us with any questions or comments that you may have. I would like to thank our panelists, all the participants, all my colleagues at UNESCO IESALC who made this webinar possible, the interpreters and the technicians, and wish you a nice day. Thank you very much.